Apologies for the slight delay. There were some technical issues which had to be sorted out. Mr. Kennedy.
So thank you. The apology actually should come from me, because it was my technical difficulties which hadn't been sorted out.
Well, that's very noble of you.
Not at all. It's perhaps a positive place to start. As you know, but others don't, or may not, my name is Andrew Kennedy. I appear at the inquiry on behalf of the UK Haemophilia Centre Doctors Organisation, instructed by Tanya Francis at Hempsons. So can I start where I started in writing and just say this. The UKHCDO, I'm going to use that abbreviation throughout, the UKHCDO recognises the tragic events of the 1970s, the 1980s and the 1990s that gave rise to the need for this inquiry. The suffering of the infected and affected has been and must remain at the forefront of the work of your inquiry. That remains the case today as it did at the start. UKHCDO wishes to express the utmost sympathy for the infected and affected, many of whom continue to attend haemophilia centres across the UK today. Since its inception, UKHCDO as an organisation has attempted to support and advocate for people with bleeding disorders, and this remains the main focus of the organisation today. So whatever factual determination the inquiry may reach as to the events of these decades, the reasons for decisions made and taken, and any culpability of individuals or organisations, it should at all times be remembered that the infected and affected were the innocent victims of events over which they had no control. Reading the written submissions of the core participants on behalf of the infected and affected, listening to the oral submissions of my learned friend Mr. Snowden and my learned friend Miss Gollop over the last 2 days, watching the loving and moving tribute to Lee shown on Tuesday only serves to reinforce this point. The current executive of the UKHCDO is acutely aware of the suffering of those innocent victims, and so it is determined to take to heart the lessons to be learned from your report and to implement fully any recommendations that you may make. So you designated the organisation as a core participant on the 19th of October 2018, following acceptance of an invitation which the inquiry, I anticipate on your direction, had proffered. Hempsons were instructed just before Christmas 2018, and I was instructed in the summer of 2019. Hence, neither Hempsons nor I, nor indeed the UKHCDO, appeared at the opening of the inquiry on the 24th of September 2018. But present today is Professor Pratima Chowdhury, who is the current chair of the organisation and the co-chair of the National Haemophilia Database. She sits towards the back of the room. She is also, sir, as you may recall, the author of the NHD statistics report that was provided pursuant to the inquiry's Rule 9 request. At that opening hearing, my learned friend Miss Richards noted that the organisation had given the inquiry unrestricted access to all of its material, physical and electronic, which she described as a huge repository of material. Accessing that material has involved or included the inquiry's investigators attending the National Haemophilia Database in Manchester to inspect its paper archive. The volume of material is perhaps unsurprising, given that the organisation spans the entire period of your inquiry. And so it spans the period from the late 1960s through to today. And as you know, the database has collected statistics for the entirety of that period. As part of the inquiry's disclosure exercise, we have considered almost 6,000 documents at the request of the inquiry. That is 6,000 documents emanating from the organisation. We have taken no objection to disclosure of any documents, and our comments to the inquiry have been confined to proposals for redactions. As a consequence of that exercise, the inquiry has made available to core participants of the order of 2,800 documents which emanate from the UK HCDO. And those documents have been available to core participants on relativity. And if you do the simple exercise of trawling through who has disclosed what, you will see that the UK HCDO's disclosure is amongst the largest disclosure of all of the core participants, and indeed all of those who've disclosed material to your inquiry. Can I, sir, reiterate at the outset of my observations the UK HCDO's gratitude to the inquiry. As we explain in paragraph 7 of our submissions, our written submissions, much of the focus of the organisation during the evidence hearing phase has been on the preparation of the report to answer the inquiry's Rule 9 request for a UK-wide report on bleeding order statistics. And I don't know, sir, whether you've seen the letter making the request, but effectively the letter said, please could you provide an equivalent report to the report that you provided to the Penrose inquiry, but for the entirety of the UK. For the sake of the transcript, as I say, the author of which is Professor Chowdhury, the report is to be found at WITN 38226016. This was a very substantial piece of work. Again, I say unsurprising, given that the period that we looked at was one of more than 50 years, from 1969 to 2020, that the inquiry's request was that the data be set out on an annual basis, disaggregated, as the expression used in the letter, to centre and specifying the amount of each product used. Those who have read the report, and more particularly been through the spreadsheets, will appreciate the extent of the exercise. So whilst much of the data, and this is my gratitude on behalf of the organisation, whilst much of the data was already computerised, some of it was not, and the organisation is grateful to the inquiry for the assistance it's been able to provide to enable the final digitisation of the database, and perhaps more particularly for facilitating the exchange of information with NHS Digital and other organisations. And the reality is the inquiry has been able to cut through red tape where we have not been able to. And that has allowed us to complete the database, if I can put it like that, with up-to-date information, particularly about cause of death. So, as we say in our written submissions, towards the end at paragraph 276, our suggestion is that the report demonstrates the value of the database. I acknowledge that some have expressed concerns that their data is held, whether by the database or at all. But we would hope that, having now seen the report, those who have been concerned can now see the merit, or at least some merit, in that data being collected and being made available. So we addressed issues of consent to the holding of data and access to data in our written submissions in paragraphs 53 to 64. I do not propose, unless you wish me to repeat those now, but I would direct anybody to those paragraphs, but more particularly to what is said on the UKHCDO website about what is said on the UKHCDO website addressing the information that is held and how to go about accessing it. We believe that the database is without rival across the world. So we referenced in our written submissions European research, including about the incidence of such databases, that showed in 2008 only a bare majority of European countries had a national haemophilia patient registry, as it was referred to in that paper. But by that stage, the database was entering early middle age. We suggest that the value is underscored by the work undertaken by your statistics expert group, and in particular, the complex modelling that it had to undertake to make an assessment of the impact of infected blood on transfusion recipients for whom there was no equivalent longitudinal data. And in simple terms, sir, all one has to do is to compare the accuracy of figures that the group provided for HCV and HIV infections, and also for deaths, for those with bleeding disorders, against those for people with blood transfusions. And you'll recall the breadth or the range of possible accurate answers to the latter. So can I then just say one or two more words about the balance of our involvement with the inquiry? Aside from the Rule 9 request for the statistics report, UKHCDO received two further Rule 9 requests. They both emanated from criticisms that had been made by witnesses who'd either provided written statements or given oral evidence, or a combination of the two. The first sought clarification of information held by the database concerning a relative of the witness, of a witness who had given a statement to the inquiry. It was a very detailed inquiry in relation to why does it say X when I believe Y. I don't wish in any way to diminish the import of the request, but it was confined, as I say, to a detailed inquiry about the entry for one patient on the database. The second request that we had related to criticisms made by Jason Evans, primarily about the legality of data held on the database and information sharing, and also the criticisms that set out in the tainted blood document. Those were the two Rule 9 requests that we received in addition to that for the statistics report. So a number of clinicians have provided statements to the inquiry about UKHCDO.
I think the orchestra are leaving.
I was going to recount a story about that, but I won't do it now. It's not the time or place. So I was saying a number of clinicians have provided statements about UKHCDO or their involvement with the organisation, and some of those witnesses have given evidence to the inquiry. Each has done so in a personal capacity in this sense. Their statements were prepared by their defence organisations or by, we anticipate, their employing trusts. The UKHCDO legal team was not involved in the preparation of the statements, and we were told when we inquired about the Rule 9 requests that they were confidential to the clinician. So the written evidence that you have received in relation to the UKHCDO has been prepared without any input from the UKHCDO legal team. Now, that may well be a good thing. It certainly would answer any suggestion of a party line taken by the organisation. But it follows also from that that the witnesses who have given evidence before you, none of those has been, as my learned friend Miss Gray put it yesterday, supported by, in this case, the UKHCDO legal team. We explain in our written submissions that the current executive of the organisation has concluded that it should not take a position on the issues that you have to decide or the factual findings that you should make. I'm conscious that there was disquiet yesterday when that stance was explored with my learned friend Miss Gray, and I set out, if I may, the rationale for that position. There are 3 points. First, the UKHCDO is a professional membership society. The organisation is in effect the sum of its individual members. It does not have a corporate identity or a corporate memory in the same way that perhaps an NHS trust might have. Second, the current executive and indeed membership self-evidently is not made up of the same individuals as the membership of the time at the material time in the 1970s, 80s and 90s. And much as the inquiry has faced challenges in obtaining accurate and reliable evidence in relation to matters which occurred over 40 years ago, the UKHCDO's membership and executive is not in a position to comment definitively on events about which they have little or no first-hand knowledge. And I underscore the point I made to you a moment ago, sir, that those who have spoken about the UKHCDO have done so with their, if I can put it like this, clinician hats on rather than their UKHCDO hats on. Perhaps more importantly than either of those 2 points is this. The current executive and the wider membership of the organisation have a continuing therapeutic and professional relationship with some of the infected and affected and with others with haemophilia. It is felt that for the organisation to take a position as to the merits of the issues with which the inquiry is concerned would be potentially to compromise that continuing therapeutic relationship. So it is for those reasons, that is the rationale, as I put it, for the stance that we have taken of not seeking to comment on what findings you should make or indeed not make. So, can I, acknowledging what I have just said, just draw your attention to one or two matters with the greatest respect about the fact-finding exercise. And I do so conscious of what my learned friend Mr. Snowden said yesterday about the passage of time. I don't think it can be said of the organisation that we can't blame something which is, lay the blame for something which is our fault. And I'm very conscious of the point that he made to you, with which I agree, which is that you are well familiar with dealing with issues of fading memories. So I say no more about that. But so the passage of time, or rather with the passage of time, come developments in practice and changes in prevailing standards. And the inquiry may wish to acknowledge and take that point into account. I would then, if I may, respectfully adopt what the Department of Health legal team said about guarding against hindsight bias. And we would, I don't know if you recall it, sir, or others recall it, we would underscore the maze analogy which they drew in their submissions at paragraph 1.24. They said this: the first and fundamental point is that it is now potentially impossible to trace over the decisions of the past, and they give the example in relation to the risk of AIDS in the 1980s, without being influenced by the awareness of what comes next. Rather like trying to retrace one's way to the centre of a maze which has been successfully negotiated, the route on the second journey into the maze will be influenced, consciously or subconsciously, by the previous successful trip or roadmap. Less weight or attention is given to blind alleys or false starts that seemed appropriate routes, even promising ones at the time, but were later shown to be mistaken. Time exploring them is more likely to be discounted. Equally, it may be harder to give credence or weight to the intentions and plans of those involved at the time, when later shown to be flawed. Again, sir, I acknowledge that that is something that you will be familiar with overcoming, but I just, as I say, endorse that point.
Well, it used to be early in my career, when I dealt with quite a lot of industrial injury accidents in practice. I know some advocates would say to a judge, well, look at the changes there have been in practice now as a result of this accident. That should have been done beforehand. And it was never a proper answer.
No.
It might indicate, in some circumstances, depending on the context, that more could have been done, but it might not.
It wasn't a complete answer.
No.
No.
So it's a question of context. And context, I think, is knowing as best one can. It is the past, and the past, someone has said, is a foreign country. But it's understanding, trying to understand as best one can what the context was, and bear in mind what, at the time, the context should have been, if
Indeed.
It wasn't.
Indeed.
It's a complex judgment.
It is indeed. We refer to it as context in our submissions, and indeed that is what it is. So I say this with a little trepidation. Given what Mr. Snowden said on Tuesday, we undertook the exercise of setting out a form of presentation. I use a small p rather than the large p, given the presentations that CTI have produced, of the minutes of the meetings of UKHCDO and some of its working parties, to assist the inquiry in this sense by placing all that material in chronological order and in one document with the guide to where it is to be found on relativity. We hope it is more than just a chronology. It was, however, consciously a summary. And nothing, sir, should be taken from the amount of detail or the lack of detail with which we have dealt with events in that part of our written closing. It is intended to be neutral. It includes material that is both positive and negative so far as the organisation is concerned. So it speaks, for instance, to the preference expressed by directors in the early 1970s for imported concentrates. It speaks equally to the views of the directors and the organisation that self-sufficiency had to be achieved and had to be achieved soon. And we've endeavoured to strike a balance as best we can. My learned friend also said, Mr. Snowden also said that we'd said nothing about the Heathrow meeting in January 1983. He is correct. I simply recorded that it had happened. That was for the simple reason that we believed that it was an event that the inquiry had considered in depth and the significance of which was largely obvious. We simply therefore placed the meeting in its chronological context with other meetings of the organisation so as to permit you, sir, to take a longitudinal view. So we set out the origins of the organisation in our written submissions. We explained that in the absence of direct evidence, we've drawn information from material available on relativity, some of which is from our archive. I don't propose, you'll be glad to hear, to cover that ground orally. I would just say this of the organisation. Whilst we acknowledge that criticisms have been and may in the future be made of the organisation and how it has acted in the past, and that it has been slow to act in the past, that there is countervailing evidence that shows that the organisation has at times been a leader and not a follower. I've mentioned in my submissions the database. I would also mention its attitude towards the promotion of comprehensive care. And again, so you may recall that the 2008 European inquiry stressed the importance of comprehensive care. I would add a third point, and it is this. It is the introduction of professional peer review in Scotland and Ireland in 1991 and England and Wales in 1992 and 1993. And the organisation believes that this is one of the earliest examples of professional peer review in the NHS. And so to give you a chronological landmark, if I can put it like that, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, what we know as NICE, now called the National Institute for Clinical and Healthcare Excellence, that was set up in 1999. Now, it's not a direct comparator, but it may be just, it will give you a chronological landmark. So it's a little bit short of a decade behind the introduction of peer review by the organisation. So the organisation aims to consider the contemporaneous uncertainties in managing individuals with bleeding disorders, to enhance the understanding of inherited bleeding disorders and their management, and to improve the quality of care for this group of people. As is typical of such professional societies, the UKHCDO seeks to provide guidance where reliable evidence is available. In the absence of good evidence, it provides a forum for examining existing information, exchanging opinions and experience, and articulating a consensus on the potential approaches to deal with challenges reported in routine clinical practice. It encourages collaboration, both nationally and internationally. As we've pointed out in our written submissions, sir, these deliberations also permit the identification of unmet needs or service deficiencies. Since its inception, the membership of the organisation has been drawn from all 4 home nations. This continues to be the case today, despite devolution. Hence, the organisation seeks to improve the quality of care of people with bleeding disorders, irrespective of the policies and priorities of their national commissioners and providers. That said, as we say in our written submission, healthcare policy is the province of the UK Department of Health, NHS commissioners and other designated bodies and their equivalents in the devolved nations. We seek to influence healthcare and clinical policies through interactions with members of these organisations and other national and regional bodies. But as we explain in our written submissions, we don't have a role in the accreditation or ongoing assessment of doctors. That falls to the General Medical Council and the Royal Colleges. So can I address 1 or 2 points arising from the submissions of other core participants? And then I have some comments to make about recommendations. One recurring theme is that UK HCDO was dominated by those at its head or by the largest haemophilia centres. Before looking at that briefly, can I just observe this? From the outset, so that's back to Rosemary Biggs in 1968-9 and the early meetings of the 1970s, the Department of Health, then the Ministry of Health, and the blood transfusion centres were regular attenders at UK HCDO meetings, and the department continued to be an attender at meetings. And I hope captured that in that part of our written submissions. Similarly, the Haemophilia Society was an early and regular attender at the annual general meeting. The first record that I can identify is the 1st of November 1974. The relativity reference is HCDO 301017. But again, we capture that in our written closing. My learned friend, on behalf of the Lead A core participants, and I hope they'll forgive me if I give them that name, described the organisation as a voluntary and unincorporated association. That is subs 5059_210 at paragraph 26, where my learned friends wrote this. It proved to be significant that this de facto leadership organisation was a voluntary and unincorporated association, essentially dominated by the largest and most influential centres. We certainly would agree with the first part of that proposition, in other words, a voluntary and unincorporated organisation, and that remained the case, as you will be aware, certainly up until the early 90s with charitable status and the limited company. So that was the status for much of the period you're concerned with. Whether, on the other hand, it was, and I would add, inappropriately, so whether it was inappropriately dominated by the largest and most influential centres is a matter, sir, that you will have to wrestle with. I just make this observation. We've set out how the organisation and its meetings changed over time in paragraph 66 and following of our written closing. and you will have seen that for much of the period, the reference centre directors, as they were called, met at least biannually, and all the directors once a year. It's perhaps unsurprising if the directors of the larger centres played a greater role, for the simple reason that they attended meetings 3 or perhaps 4 times a year, whereas the directors of haemophilia centres or associate centres only once a year. And that is, for understandable reasons, a meeting of 10 or 12 is easier to organise, certainly in pre-Zoom days, than a meeting of 78. We know from personal experience that in organisations such as this, it is often the case that one personality or one or more personalities may dominate. But whether the larger centres inappropriately dominate, as I say so, is something you may want to wrestle with. You may bear in mind that their directors will have brought greater experience, if not greater expertise, greater experience coming from treatment of a greater number of patients. My learned friends, on behalf of the Hempsons core participants, make a similar point. They say the UKHCDO was a club dominated by those at its head. In their submissions, which is subs 5064_0247, at paragraph 4.55, they said this: in the evidence heard by the inquiry from government ministers, the clinical freedom, which they put in inverted commas, was championed as a means of the government evading ultimate responsibility when things went wrong in the medical sphere. In fact, given that the individual haemophilia clinicians were bound by the diktats of this group, what is more, Dr. Winter described the group as being a form of club where the views of the few at the top predominated. This approach to centralised decision making by a few core individuals had important ramifications for the care of haemophilia patients generally, but also as for the formulation of policy in the care of haemophiliacs in Scotland in particular. I just say this: the observation of dominated by those at the top, we leave to you, but we would just, with respect, correct what my learned friends say when they attribute that expression to Dr. Winter. And if we can just bring up Dr. Winter's evidence. He gave evidence on the 1st of October of 2020. And my learned friend, Miss Richards, asked Dr. Winter the question at the bottom of page 114 of the transcript. Thank you, Lawrence. She said, "Can I ask you one further question about UKHCDO? Not at any point in time, but in the knowledge that you are about to become a member in the end of 1983 when you became a director in Kent. Professor Savage, who you obviously dealt with quite extensively over the following months and years, in his evidence to the Archer inquiry, was very much critical of the UKHCDO. He said it was run pretty much as a club by the 10 or so main players, and there was something of an information vacuum for directors in particular of smaller centres. And she asked him whether he would agree with that, whether that was his experience once he became a director. Forgive me, I paraphrase her final question. But Dr. Winter's answer is, we would suggest, informative. He says, I don't agree with that. I think we should state UKHCDO was generally regarded by the other haemophilia societies and doctors and other countries as actually being a model of its kind. There isn't really any other country where haemophilia doctors came together and collaborated to such an extent that every patient with an inherited blood disease in the country was registered. We knew the number of patients with the condition. We knew the severity of the condition. We knew whether they had an inhibitor. We knew whether they were on home treatment. We knew whether they were alive or dead. No other patient had information like this. And every time you went to a World Federation meeting, people would say, you know, your system you have in the UK is light years, I suspect he means ahead of what we have in our country. We have nothing like it. Then in addition to that, as we've seen already, it was a very active organisation. Thank you, Lawrence. In addition to all the day-to-day work we were doing, at any one time there would be 6, 7, 8 working parties in specialist areas. So I thought the UK HCDO was a very good thing. Of course, there were personalities involved, of which Professor Savage was a large one. Thank you, Lawrence. So my learned friend, Miss Gollop, on behalf of the Haemophilia Society, says in her written submissions on a number of occasions that the UKHCDO was the most authoritative body or voice in the UK. We suggest that that is neither surprising nor sinister, certainly objectively. It was formed of most, if not all, doctors treating haemophilia on a regular basis. That is, it was a group sharing a common interest or concern in the treatment of a discrete disease. And we would anticipate that the same might be said of a number of equivalent professional societies, both then and now, where the number of patients suffering the disease is such that it would not support more than one professional society. That said, this is my comment objectively, that said, we would entirely accept that with that status comes responsibility. And the inquiry will have to address whether the organisation did or did not discharge that responsibility. Another point that is made is that the guidance that was issued by the organisation was not mandatory. In particular, and it's said by the DHSC, sorry, forgive me, the DHSC mentioned the evidence of Dr. Walford, that the guidance issued in June of 1983 was weak because it was advisory rather than mandatory. And so perhaps I should just fill in the dots. So the guidance that I'm referring to is that of the 24th of June 1983. I'm assuming that everybody is so invested in the detail of this case that they will know what I'm referring to, but it was the first guidance that came from UKHCDO that bore in mind the AIDS, bore in mind AIDS. In terms of what the organisation could and could not achieve, we would agree with Lee Day, the Lee Day core participants, when they say that we could not have granted ourselves, I paraphrase, could not have granted ourselves a power to make binding clinical recommendations. That is subs 5059_0212, paragraph 33. And we agree with what is self-evidently implicit in that statement, which is that we didn't have that power. Plainly, sir, it will be a matter for you whether the guidance that was promulgated should have been expressed in stronger terms. Both should have been expressed in stronger terms and should have been more extensive or more expansive. But we would simply say to you, sir, that the organisation was not in a position to mandate or direct the practice or treatment provided by clinicians. There are perhaps two relevant points to make. First, we had no power to do so, but we also had no means of enforcing a direction. And if you, sir, I can see you perhaps mentally posing yourself a question. If you look, for instance, at the guidance issued in 1997 in relation to recombinant products, and I touch on that in my written closing, even that, it may be said it goes further than what was said in 1983, but even that doesn't say you must do this. It says you should. So it seems to us that the question is whether the guidance should have been expressed more strongly rather than it should have been set out in mandatory terms. And we would also just invite you to bear in mind that if this guidance was to be expressed in mandatory terms, it would have had to apply not just to haemophilia centres, but to any hospital that might treat a haemophiliac, and indeed, arguably across the board, because it would be relevant to those receiving blood transfusions. And so we would respectfully suggest that if mandatory guidance was required, it needed to come from a body with greater and broader authority than UKHCDO. I think acknowledging that point, the Lead A Corps participants suggest that the organisation should have should have asked for itself to be put on a statutory footing. We're not clear how that could have been achieved, but it seems to us that that would have had two main drawbacks. First, the organisation would have become simply another arm of government or the department. And it's unclear to us where the organisation would have sat, for instance, in relation to a body such as the CSM. There is also evidence that you've seen, sir, and heard, that at times the government didn't listen to the organisation anyway. Perhaps more significantly from the organisation's perspective, had that happened, it would have lost its independence, and it would have significantly curtailed, we would suggest, its ability to speak on behalf of those with bleeding disorders and indeed those treating them. I'm conscious of time. I'm moving slower than I'd anticipated, but there were three examples, and I will take them very briefly. One is self-sufficiency. Two is, as I mentioned earlier, recombinant products, where the department's response was, we're not going to sign off your guidance because, well, I'll leave others to answer the because. And the third example is what happened in relation to variant CJD and what the organisation said about the use of domestic blood at the time of the variant CJD concerns. Can I deal then with one matter which arises in the submissions made by the Collins Corps participants, and it's a short point, and it's just this: when discussing the issue of candour, but albeit in the context of a chapter on ministers, but in a chapter a proposition that is repeated in the chapter on clinicians, my learned friends say of the article that Dr. Peter Jones wrote to the Press Council. And so if it helps, I can ask Lawrence to bring that up. So this is PJON. So this is the, forgive me, article letter. So this is the letter that Dr. Peter Jones wrote on the 6th of May 1983, complaining about an article that had been in the Mail on Sunday, 5 days before. My learned friends say that Dr. Jones was writing on behalf of UKHCDO. And it's that latter part which concerns me. There is, of course, a legitimate question for you to address as to whether Dr. Jones was correct to write in the terms that he did. And it may be, I accept, maybe that others within the organisation shared the sentiments that he expressed in this letter. But we're unclear whether it is correct to say that this was the organisation seeking, as my learned friends put it, to shut the story down. I deal with, if I may, jumping on to something that my learned friends for the Milner's Corps participants say. The reference to their submissions is subs 605_0117 at paragraph 350. And it's just a correction of a relativity reference. But they say this. They say, nevertheless, by January 1983, the issue of AIDS remained a footnote or afterthought in the minute of the meeting of the UKHCDO, which took place on 8 January that year. The directors noted that AIDS was similar in its epidemiology to HPV, and that the Working Party ought to inquire about the likely transmission of the disease through blood and blood products. In our submission, this lack of recognition of the severity of risk posed is characteristic of the UKHCDO's lethargic approach to addressing emergency threats. So the short point is this, that footnote, or afterthought as they put it, was not the 8th of January 1983. It was a meeting that the relativity reference is this, HCDO 603_058. That is a relativity reference to a meeting, the minutes of a meeting of the the Hepatitis Working Party on the 13th of September 1982. And the date may be important for the allegation of lethargy, but you will appreciate it. That comes about the midpoint between the two CDC letters of 1982. A meeting of the Hepatitis Working Party took place on the 19th of January 1983, and it's apparent from the from the minutes that AIDS was one of the central issues that was addressed. So that's we address in our submissions at paragraph 124. So two further matters which arise from submissions. One is this: it relates to the issue of clinical freedom. A number of core participants have warned or cautioned of the perils of unfettered clinical freedom. And some have hinted to a suggestion that there is need for a review and qualification of clinical freedom. Can we just say this in response to that? As we said a moment ago, sir, the practice of medicine has changed substantially over the years with which you are concerned. There have been extraordinary advances in treatment, both surgical and medical. There has, we would suggest also, been a change in what we might term the deference that a patient has for his or her doctor. There are legitimate, no doubt, criticisms of a paternalistic attitude in the 1970s and indeed later. We don't say that that has been abolished in its entirety, but I think we can all recognize significant changes. Today's patient is much more prepared to question his or her doctor than the patient in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s. Moreover, we would suggest that in reality, with the increasing use of evidence-based medicine, the acknowledgement that departure from guidance needs to be justified and informed consent sought, the advent of organisations such as NICE means that clinical freedom, or rather there is less clinical freedom now than there was 30 years ago. Moreover, we would caution reaching conclusions about clinical freedom based upon what I might refer to as a small sample size. So having looked at one discrete area of medicine. And equally caution recognizing, as one of your expert groups recognized, that clinical freedom permits incremental change in practice. Then, sir, if I can just turn briefly to research. Again, much has been written and said about research. The organisation would accept that during the relevant period, clinicians who were UKHCDO members conducted studies in the sense of clinical trials or what might be referred to as interventional research. We would also accept that these studies were often discussed at meetings of the organisation, and we have referred in our written submission to discussion of, for instance, trial protocols. I just wish to make this clear on behalf of the organisation. That research was not conducted by UKHCDO. It was conducted by people who were members of the UKHCDO. The organisation has confined its research, so that is research that is published in its name, to observational studies, what I'm going to refer to as observational studies. It's referred to elsewhere perhaps as audit, service evaluation, or observational research. And that observational research is conducted, or rather involves, a retrospective study primarily of data collected as part of the annual returns. So I've mentioned some examples of this. And again, conscious of time, the earliest, I think, example of this is Dr. Biggs's study at the beginning of the 1970s of the incidence of jaundice and antibodies or inhibitors, which was published in 1974. That is PRSE 302554, and if that is looked up, you will see that she writes on behalf of, I think she says, the 37 directors of haemophilia centres. There are similar examples that we cite in our submissions, written submissions at paragraph 24. For instance, again, Dr. Biggs's review of haemophilia treatment, 1969 to 74, and equivalent exercises undertaken by Dr. Ritzer during later periods. So I'm going to turn, if I may, briefly to recommendations. I've been going for an hour. I would propose, subject to your views, that I press on and finish. I don't think I will be more than another 10 or 15 minutes.
Then by all means do so.
I should just add that I am about the worst judge of time.
Well, you won't be in a minority of one in that respect.
I can hear my learned friend Miss Richards making an aside, which may indicate that she and I are in the same boat. So can I just say...
I couldn't possibly comment.
Can I just... I'm not going to... We've set out our views on recommendations in writing. I'm not going to go through all of what we've said. I just want to touch on 4 points, 2 of which, as will be apparent when I come to them, forgive me, I think it's 5 points, 2 of which are, 2 or 3 of which are of particular interest to the organisation. I just say a word about compensation. We recognise that it may rightly be said that compensation is no business of UKHCDO. But I would just say this, adopting the approach that my learned friend Mr. Snowden took on Tuesday of identifying matters which perhaps the lawyers weren't concerned about, but the clients were. And he identified natural clearers as being falling into that category. And I identify that too. And that was something that was specifically mentioned to me when we were setting out our response to recommendations. And so what we would say, or rather what the organisation would say, is particularly encapsulated in what Mrs. Francis and I wrote at paragraph 262. I say no more than that. Haemophilia centres, I think my own friend Miss Gollop adopted that earlier, but if I can take it in more detail if you wish.
No, I've read it more than once.
Then I won't make you read it again. Then just if I may, haemophilia centres as centres of excellence. We support the suggestions made by other core participants that haemophilia centres should be centres of excellence. It will come as no surprise that, as we say in our written submissions, that the central issue is one of funding, both as we put it, adequacy generally, and consistency and transparency. We note at paragraph 265 that collaboration between UKHCDO and the Haemophilia Society and the Commercial Medicines Unit resulted in a very significant saving in the unit cost of medicines due to UK-wide procurement. It had been hoped that some of the savings generated could be used to support the development of comprehensive care. Sadly, that was not the case. That has not proved the case. At 264, we point out that the provision of comprehensive care is the first step to becoming a centre of excellence. And this requires a team of doctors, nurses, and allied professionals. Unhappily, peer review undertaken by the organisation has identified persistent problems securing a full complement of multidisciplinary team members. I could just add at this point, we've seen what one of the, I think, unrepresented core participant, Elizabeth Buggins, says about multidisciplinary team working. I don't know if she's here today, but we agree wholeheartedly with what she says. The problems and some of the solutions we are highlighting in paragraph 266. In summary, commissioning must be cohesive and standardised across the UK. There must be a single service specification for all of the UK to ensure that all people with bleeding disorders have access to high quality and comprehensive care. And thirdly, any update of the service specification must be taken with the involvement of all stakeholders, with particular focus on those with bleeding disorders, so that their views are not just heard, but actively addressed. And so we set out at 267 a form of words which may or may not find favour. Then, if I may, just turning to what I've described as the future of UKHCDO and the National Haemophilia Database. And just referencing what I said a moment ago about service standards, we would anticipate that the UKHCDO will, as it has done in the past and in conjunction with other patient organisations, play a significant role in any future discussion about service specification. We suggest that its ability to play that significant role reflects its position, or the position that it occupies, standing between the patient and the department. And it permits the organisation to advocate for patients, to commissioners and to the department. And it's for that reason that we would resist any suggestion that the organisation go into a form of public ownership. I said earlier that I mentioned 3 points about independence. And I'd just say briefly this. Had, by way of illustration, UKHCDO been within the department tent, if I can put it like that, in 1996 and 1997, it would not have been able to speak in the terms in which it did when issuing guidance about recombinant products. That's WITN 3289048, nor in the terms in which it did about plasma collection from UK donors at the time of variant CJD. That's WITN 7034006. And so,
just give me that number again.
WITN 7034006. That is Professor Ludlam's letter to the Lancet of December 1997, where he made 2 points. One, what one might refer to colloquially as recombinant for all, and two, to be wary of UK donors, given what was known about variant CJD. We would therefore suggest that a recommendation that had the impact of reducing or removing the independence of an organisation such as UKHCDO, and arguably would be carried over to any professional society that one might name, would be a significant retrograde step. We note in this respect, sir, and are grateful for the support that the organisation receives from the Scottish Territorial Health Boards. At paragraph 220 of their submissions, they say this: the UK HCDO and the British Society for Haematology currently provide guidance on optimal treatment for people with bleeding disorders. Those organisations and the National Haemophilia Database also raise awareness of developments in patient safety concerns. This work is of great value in terms of both keeping clinicians up to date on best practice and enabling rapid identification of new safety concerns. And they give a recommendation about security of funding. On the issue of the future of the database, just briefly this, we believe that it is uncontroversial that a database should be maintained to track disease incidence, prevalence trends, and clinical outcomes, and in particular mortality over time. As I said earlier, that permits identification of unmet needs in the context of an evolving therapeutic and organisational landscape, and it informs healthcare planning. It is also consistent with the recommendations for the European Association of Haemophilia, as I mentioned in my written closing. I've addressed you already on what we say is demonstrably the value of the database, of the exercise that the statistics group had to undertake. We don't detect within the statistic group report or the oral evidence of particular concern about shortcomings of data collection, but we do recognise what Professor Bird said towards the conclusion of the statistics, towards the conclusion of the evidence of the statistics group, and we would endorse what she says about funding and about the need for greater epidemiological input. I just say this of the database. I said earlier that we think it's the first comprehensive database to be established in the world. It's a model that has been adopted elsewhere. It is a tribute to the foresight of clinicians such as Dr. Biggs that it exists at all. It is a tribute to those in the 1970s and 1980s who encouraged and cajoled sometimes reluctant or recalcitrant centres to submit their data. Without their work, the database might have withered and ceased to exist, as you know happened in Canada. And I acknowledge that those people I have just referred to are people who may elsewhere be criticised. Our simple concern, or rather the organisation's simple concern, is that accepting a proposal of incorporating the database within the wider NHS would expose it to the budgetary constraints that we hear and read about every day. It would render it vulnerable to compromise due to decisions about spending priorities. And we would suggest that there must be significant doubt that had the database been under NHS management for the entire period or for much of the period with which you are inquiring, then you may well not have had access to the same extent of longitudinal data that you have received. That said, we acknowledge that the database must adapt and change to meet future needs. There must be continued involvement of those with bleeding disorders on the management group. And again, we've touched on that in writing. I just add one final point, which is perhaps relevant to ownership. under the stewardship of UKHCDO, the database provides UKHCDO with access to the information from which it can generate treatment guidance. If they were divorced one from the other, it's unclear to us how the data would be accessed, or whether the organisation would end up paying the database for the data. My last matter in terms of peer review is just this. You will have seen that WMQRS, a West Midlands Quality Research Service, I think, ceased to exist during the COVID pandemic, and the organisation is seeking to put in place arrangements for peer review or audit for the forthcoming round. I am sure that the organisation will keep you updated if you wish as to its progress, but we cannot say anything more at this stage than we have said in writing. So can I just conclude with this on behalf of UKHCDO? I say this to Lee's family, to Andrew, who spoke on Tuesday, who is determined that something positive should come from his experience. I say it to Barbara, who spoke most movingly yesterday, to those who will speak after me from this lectern in the coming days, and to the many, many more people who have given evidence before you, sir, whether on paper or in person. We, on behalf of UKHCDO, hope that Sir Brian's report provides you with the answers that you have campaigned for and that you deserve. So thank you. That is all I have to say on behalf of UKHCDO.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy. The inquiry recognises and thanks the UKHCDO for the data that it has supplied to our statistical experts, enabling the inquiry to produce the degree of statistical certainty that is available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
So tomorrow then, we have in the morning at 10 o'clock Ms Monaghan on behalf of the core participants represented by Saunders Solicitors. And then at 2 o'clock, we have Ms Maharaj, who's the Vice Chair of the UK Thalassemia Society.
So 10 o'clock tomorrow.